inclusion of Aegon's prophecy in House of the Dragon was always going to be a very touchy subject among the wider fanbase, largely thanks to the lackluster and frankly disappointing ending of the final season of Game of Thrones, which overall was handled very poorly. I worked in media for over 10 years, and I've been an avid follower of stuff like this for many years before that, and I can safely say I've never seen an ending of a TV show or a final season of a show damage a franchise so badly as Game of Thrones Season 8. The way in which Game of Thrones fell out of the public consciousness is frankly shocking, and I've never seen anything like it. I was very nervous during the build-up to House of the Dragon as a result, and was very worried the show was going to be dead on arrival, but thankfully, some very good promotional work and excellent word of mouth allowed House of the Dragon to effectively reignite the fire inside the brand. I predicted going into House of the Dragon that they would try and distance themselves somewhat from the story and ending of Game of Thrones as much as they could to try and give the brand a clean break. So when leaks started to trickle out a few days before the show officially premiered, detailing the inclusion of the concept of Aegon's prophecy, I know many in the fandom, more specifically on Reddit and Twitter, had full-on meltdowns, declaring that House of the Dragon was a disaster and just more HBO Game of Thrones level trash. While I do think that reaction was extremely hyperbolic, I do understand why many fans feared the worst and why this caught many by surprise. I do have to admit that when I did read the leak and did watch the episode early, I did have a sinking feeling in my gut and was very concerned about the implication this would have on the quality of House of the Dragon as a whole. I suspected they would include a few Easter eggs and callbacks to the main show as fan service, so when the first promo images showed Viserys and Alicent holding the infamous cat's paws dagger, I assumed that's all it was. So when the full extent of the idea of Aegon's prophecy came to light, yes, I was very surprised. Like much of the fan base in general, even during the run of the first season, I never quite felt comfortable with the idea. But after rewatching the show a couple of times now, and rereading Fire and Blood and the main series, I do feel quite a lot better about it. So Aegon's prophecy is the idea that Aegon the Conqueror foresaw the coming of the Long Night and the White Walkers in a dream, and decided that he would invade the Seven Kingdoms, knowing that the only way to stop the coming Long Night was a strong unified Westeros. This knowledge was then passed from king to heir, till we get to Viserys telling Rhaenyra this information in House of the Dragon. I do like the concept of Aegon's prophecy and the idea of Aegon invading Westeros due to the knowledge of the Long Night and White Walkers. It's rather an old fan theory, in fact among one of the oldest and most discussed. But here's the crux of the issue, and what a lot of fans, even now, have trouble with when it comes to having this idea as a driving force of the narrative in the show. Season 8 of Game of Thrones really fumbles the Long Night and the White Walkers plotline badly. Yes, the whole season was a rush mess, but for me, the way the White Walkers and the Long Night were handled is amongst the worst of it. In all, it was very disappointing and anticlimactic given 8 seasons of build-up to that point. The moment Arya kills the Night King, I don't think I have ever felt a level of disappointment like that for a TV show. So to have the idea of Aegon's prophecy running through House of the Dragon, it reminds a lot of viewers of the negative aspects of Game of Thrones and how much of the build-up and plot lines meant nothing in the end. If House of the Dragon's wider plot has this element at the heart of it, then why should fans care at all about the show when all means nothing in the end? It was a huge risk to include it. Personally, I do like the idea of Aegon's prophecy as it pertains to the books, and in terms of the books and Fire and Blood, it does actually make a hell of a lot of sense. We know George R. R. Martin was heavily involved in the production of House of the Dragon, and the idea of Aegon's prophecy is one that came directly from him. The fact it came directly from George and not at the insistence of HBO is a big reason as to why I feel more comfortable with the idea than when it first got leaked. In terms of canon, we know George's personal feelings on it from recent interviews is that it's all made up anyway, so ultimately it doesn't really matter in the end. But for argument's sake, I have always separated book canon and show canon, and personally only take a very few show-only things past season 5 of Game of Thrones as any indication of canon in the books. If it's something that has come directly from George R. R. Martin, I don't think there is a higher authority than that. So if Aegon's prophecy, despite how divisive it could be in terms of the show, given George's involvement, I do take it as canon to the books, at least in some form. In the end, the prophecy plays a minor role in House of the Dragon, and is used more as a plot device to enhance and complicate the dynamic between the Blacks and the Greens, and their belief in their right to the throne. Even so, it was still a huge risk to try and connect House of the Dragon back to the main show in such a way, and it could have pushed a lot of fans away from giving House of the Dragon a fair chance. And if the show had not been successful, I think there would be a lot of people citing the inclusion of elements such as Aegon's prophecy as a reason. But the reason it worked, and the reason it didn't do the damage many fans were fearing, comes down to a simple fact. House of the Dragon is far from perfect, and of course I do have some issues with some of the writing and some of the choices that were made, but on the whole it's an excellent TV show that manages to stand on its own despite the shadow and huge success and later failures of Game of Thrones. It managed to recapture the intention of a fan base who felt extremely disheartened towards the brand, even found a fair bit of mainstream appeal. I always felt that House of the Dragon would do okay. There would be a fan base ready to watch it, but I don't even believe that even HBO thought it would be the hit it was and bring the brand back not only into relevance, but also to begin to repair some of the damage left by the last season of Game of Thrones. But it's still very early days. We have one season of House of the Dragon out, season 2 in production, and the Tales of Dunk and Egg confirmed, with other spin-offs known to be in the works. Only time will tell if HBO has truly learned from the past mistakes, and if we will end up having the same conversations about House of the Dragon we did with Game of Thrones. Aegon's prophecy worried a lot of fans, and was a huge risk by the writers. Only time will tell if this is a choice they will regret. What I really want to know is how you guys feel about the inclusion of Aegon's prophecy, and what it means for House of the Dragon and the book in general. I want to hear your take on it, and try to gain a broader understanding of how people feel about its inclusion.